Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we'll talk about Gustave Le Bon's book 3, Part 4, Electoral Crowds. Here's what we'll discuss in this video. General characteristics of electoral crowds, the manner of persuading them, the qualities that should be possessed by a candidate, necessity of prestige, why working men and peasants so rarely choose candidates from their own class, the influence of words and formulas on the elector, the general aspect of election oratory, how the opinions of the elector are formed, the power of political committees. They represent the most redoubtable form of tyranny, the committees of the revolution. Universal suffrage cannot be replaced in spite of its slight psychological value. Why it is that the votes recorded would remain the same even if the right of voting were restricted to a limited class of citizens. Of what universal suffrage is the expression in all countries. Ready? Let's go. Electoral crowds, that is to say, collectivities invested with the power of electing the holders of certain functions, constitute heterogeneous crowds, but as their action is confined to a single clearly determined matter, namely to choosing between different candidates, they present only a few of the characteristics previously described. Of the characteristics peculiar to crowds, they display in particular but slight aptitude for reasoning, the absence of the critical spirit, irritability, credulity, and simplicity. In their decision, moreover, is to be traced the influence of the leaders of crowds and the part played by the factors we have enumerated: affirmation, repetition, prestige, and contagion. Let us examine by what methods electoral crowds are to be persuaded. It will be easy to deduce their psychology from the methods that are most successful. It is of primary importance that the candidate should possess prestige. Personal prestige can only be replaced by that resulting from wealth. Talent and even genius are not elements of success of serious importance. Of capital importance, on the other hand, is the necessity for the candidate of possessing prestige, of being able, that is, to force himself upon the electorate without discussion. The reason why the electors, of whom a majority are working men or peasants, so rarely choose a man from their own ranks to represent them, is that such a person enjoys no prestige among them. When by chance they do elect a man who is their equal, it is as a rule for subsidiary reasons. For instance, to spite an eminent man or an influential employer of labor on whom the elector is in daily dependence, and whose master he has the illusion he becomes in this way for a moment. The possession of prestige does not suffice, however, to assure the success of a candidate. The elector stickles in particular for the flattery of his greed and vanity. He must be overwhelmed with the most extravagant blandishments, and there must be no hesitation in making him the most fantastic promises. If he is a working man, it is impossible to go too far in insulting and stigmatizing employers of labor. As for the rival candidate, an effort must be made to destroy his chance by establishing, by dint of affirmation, repetition, and contagion, that he is an arrant scoundrel, and that it is a matter of common knowledge that he has been guilty of several crimes. It is, of course, useless to trouble about any semblance of proof. Should the adversary be ill acquainted with the psychology of crowds, he will try to justify himself by arguments, instead of confining himself to replying to one set of affirmations by another. And he will have no chance whatever of being successful. The candidate's written program should not be too categorical, since later on his adversaries might bring it up against him. In his verbal program, however, there cannot be too much exaggeration. The most important reforms may be fearlessly promised. At the moment they are made, these exaggerations produce a great effect, and they are not binding for the future, it being a matter of constant observation that the elector never troubles himself to know how far the candidate he has returned has followed out the electoral program he applauded and in virtue of which the election was supposed to have been secured. In what precedes, all the factors of persuasion which we have described are to be recognized. We shall come across them again in the action exerted by words and formulas, whose magical sway we have already insisted upon. An orator who knows how to make use of these means of persuasion can do what he will with a crowd. Expressions such as infamous capital, vile exploiters, the admirable working man, the socialization of wealth, etc., always produce the same effect, although already somewhat worn by use. But the candidate who hits on a new formula as devoid as possible of precise meaning and apt in consequence to flatter the most varied aspirations, infallibly obtains a success. The sanguinary Spanish Revolution of 1873 was brought about by one of these magical phrases of complex meaning, on which everybody can put his own interpretation. A contemporary writer has described the launching of this phrase in terms that deserve to be quoted. The radicals have made the discovery that a centralized republic is a monarchy in disguise, and to humor them, the Cortes had unanimously proclaimed a federal republic, though none of the voters could have explained what it was he had just voted for. This formula, however, delighted everybody. The joy was intoxicating, delirious. The reign of virtue and happiness had just been inaugurated on Earth. A Republican whose opponent refused him the title of Federalist considered himself to be mortally insulted. People addressed each other in the streets with the words, "Long live the Federal Republic." After which the praises were sung of the mystic virtue of the absence of discipline in the army and of the autonomy of the soldiers. What was understood by the Federal Republic? There were those who took it to mean the emancipation of the provinces, institutions akin to those of the United States, and administrative decentralization. Others had in view the abolition of all authority and the speedy commencement of the great social liquidation. The socialists of Barcelona and Andalusia stood out for the absolute sovereignty of the communes. They proposed to endow Spain with 10,000 independent municipalities, to legislate on their own account, and their creation to be accompanied by the suppression of the police and the army. In the southern provinces, the insurrection was soon seen to spread from town to town and village to village. Directly a village had made its pronunciamiento, its first care was to destroy the telegraph wires and the railway lines, so as to cut off all communication with its neighbors and Madrid. The sorriest hamlet was determined to stand on its own bottom. Federation had given place to cantonalism, marked by massacres, incendiarism, and every description of brutality, and bloody saturnalia were celebrated throughout the length and breadth of the land. With respect to the influence that may be exerted by reasoning on the minds of electors, to harbor the least doubt on this subject can only be the result of never having read the reports of an electioneering meeting. In such a gathering, affirmations, invectives, and sometimes blows are exchanged, but never arguments. Should silence be established for a moment, it is because someone present, having the reputation of a tough customer, has announced that he is about to heckle the candidate by putting him one of those embarrassing questions which are always the joy of the audience. The satisfaction, however, of the opposition party is short-lived, for the voice of the questioner is soon drowned in the uproar made by his adversaries. The following reports of public meetings, chosen from hundreds of similar examples and taken from the daily papers, may be considered as typical. One of the organizers of the meeting having asked the assembly to elect a president, the storm bursts. The anarchists leap onto the platform to take the committee table by storm. The socialists make an energetic defense. Blows are exchanged, and each party accuses the other of being spies in the pay of the government, etc. A citizen leaves the hall with a black eye. The committee is at length installed as best it may be in the midst of the tumult, and the right to speak devolves upon Comrade X. The orator starts a vigorous attack on the socialists, who interrupt him with shouts of idiot, scoundrel, blackguard, etc. Epithets to which Comrade X replies by setting forth a theory according to which the socialists are idiots or jokers. The Alemanist Party had organized yesterday evening in the Hall of Commerce, in the Rue du Faubourg du Temple, a great meeting, preliminary to the workers' fete of the 1st of May. The watchword of the meeting was calm and tranquility. Comrade G alludes to the socialists as idiots and humbugs. At these words, there is an exchange of invectives, and orators and audience come to blows. Chairs, tables, and benches are converted into weapons, etc., etc. It is not to be imagined for a moment that this description of discussion is peculiar to a determined class of electors and dependent on their social position. In every anonymous assembly whatever, though it be composed exclusively of highly educated persons, discussion always assumes the same shape. I have shown that when men are collected in a crowd, there is a tendency towards their mental leveling at work, and proof of this is to be found at every turn. Take, for example, the following extract from a report of a meeting composed exclusively of students, which I borrow from the Temps of 13th of February, 1895. The tumult only increased as the evening went on. I do not believe that a single orator succeeded in uttering two sentences without being interrupted. At every instance, there came shouts from this or that direction, or from every direction at once. Applause was intermingled with hissing, violent discussions were in progress between individual members of the audience, sticks were brandished threateningly, others beat a tattoo on the floor, and the interrupters were greeted with yells of, "Put him out!" or "Let him speak." MC lavished such epithets as odious and cowardly, monstrous, vile, venal, and vindictive on the association which he declared he wanted to destroy, etc., etc. How, it may be asked, can an elector form an opinion under such conditions? To put such a question is to harbor a strange delusion as to the measure of liberty that may be enjoyed by a collectivity. Crowds have opinions that have been imposed upon them, but they never boast reasoned opinions. In the case under consideration, the opinions and votes of the electors are in the hands of the election committees, whose leading spirits are, as a rule, publicans, their influence over the working men, to whom they allow credit, being great. Do you know what an election committee is? Writes M. Scherer, one of the most valiant champions of present-day democracy. It is neither more nor less than the cornerstone of our institutions, the masterpiece of the political machine. France is governed today by the election committees. To exert an influence over them is not difficult, provided the candidate be in himself acceptable and possess adequate financial resources. According to the admissions of the donors, 3 millions of francs suffice to secure the repeated elections of General Boulanger. Such is the psychology of electoral crowds. It is identical with that of other crowds, neither better nor worse. In consequence, I draw no conclusion against universal suffrage from what precedes. Had I to settle its fate, I should preserve it as it is for practical reasons, which are to be deduced in point of fact from our investigation of the psychology of crowds. On this account, I shall proceed to set them forth. No doubt the weak side of universal suffrage is too obvious to be overlooked. It cannot be gainsaid that civilization has been the work of a small minority of superior intelligences, constituting the culminating point of a pyramid, whose stages, widening in proportion to the decrease of mental power, represent the masses of a nation. The greatness of a civilization cannot assuredly depend upon the votes given by inferior elements, boasting solely numerical strength. Doubtless, too, the votes recorded by crowds are often very dangerous. They have already cost us several invasions, and in view of the triumph of socialism for which they are preparing the way, it is probable that the vagaries of popular sovereignty will cost us still more dearly. Excellent, however, as these objections are in theory, in practice they lose all force, as will be admitted if the invincible strength be remembered of ideas transformed into dogmas. The dogma of the sovereignty of crowds is as little defensible, from the philosophical point of view, as the religious dogmas of the Middle Ages. But it enjoys at present the same absolute power they formerly enjoyed. It is as unattackable in consequence as in the past were our religious ideas. Imagine a modern freethinker miraculously transported into the midst of the Middle Ages. Do you suppose that after having ascertained the sovereign power of the religious ideas that were then in force, he would have been tempted to attack them? Having fallen into the hands of a judge disposed to send him to the stake, under the imputation of having concluded a pact with the devil, or of having been present at the witches' Sabbath, would it have occurred to him to call in question the existence of the devil or of the Sabbath? It were as wise to oppose cyclones with discussion as the beliefs of crowds. The dogma of universal suffrage possesses today the power the Christian dogmas formerly possessed. Orators and writers allude to it with a respect and adulation that never fell to the share of Louis XIV. In consequence, the same position must be taken up with regard to it as with regard to all religious dogmas. Time alone can act upon them. Besides, it would be the more useless to attempt to undermine this dogma, inasmuch as it has an appearance of reasonableness in its favor. In an era of equality, Tocqueville justly remarks, men have no faith in each other on account of their being all alike. Yet this same similitude gives them an almost limitless confidence in the judgment of the public. The reason being that it does not appear probable that, all men being equally enlightened, truth and numerical superiority should not go hand in hand. Must it be believed that with a restricted suffrage, a suffrage restricted to those intellectually capable if it be desired, an improvement would be affected in the votes of crowds? I cannot admit for a moment that this would be the case, and that for the reasons I have already given touching the mental inferiority of all collectivities, whatever their composition. In a crowd, men always tend to the same level, and on general questions, a vote recorded by 40 academicians is no better than that of 40 water carriers. I do not in the least believe that any of the votes for which universal suffrage is blamed, the reestablishment of the empire, for instance, would have fallen out differently had the voters been exclusively recruited among learned and liberally educated men. It does not follow because an individual knows Greek or mathematics, is an architect, a veterinary surgeon, a doctor, or a barrister, that he is endowed with a special intelligence of social questions. All our political economists are highly educated, being for the most part professors or academicians. Yet is there a single general question, protection, bimetallism, etc., on which they have succeeded in agreeing? The explanation is that their science is only a very attenuated form of our universal ignorance. With regard to social problems, owing to the number of unknown quantities they offer, men are substantially equally ignorant. In consequence, were the electorate solely composed of persons stuffed with sciences, their votes would be no better than those emitted at present. They would be guided in the main by their sentiments and by party spirit. We should be spared none of the difficulties we now have to contend with, and we should certainly be subjected to the oppressive tyranny of castes. Whether the suffrage of crowds be restricted or general, whether it be exercised under a republic or a monarchy, in France, in Belgium, in Greece, in Portugal, or in Spain, it is everywhere identical, and when all is said and done, it is the expression of the unconscious aspirations and needs of the race. In each country, the average opinions of those elected represent the genius of the race, and they will be found not to alter sensibly from one generation to another. It is seen, then, that we are confronted once more by the fundamental notion of race, which we have come across so often, and by this other notion, which is the outcome of the first, that institutions and governments play but a small part in the life of a people. Peoples are guided in the main by the genius of their race, that is, by that inherited residue of qualities, of which the genius is the sum total. Race and the slavery of our daily necessities are the mysterious master causes that rule our destiny. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check the books available in our link in the description. There you'll find many fundamental marketing books in different languages, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more marketing-related content. See you in the next one.